All right, guys, so I'm going to go over the gas exchange process inside of our lungs. Basically, I've found that this is kind of a harder topic for students to understand, so I just wanted to go through it step by step, and this is exactly what we have written in our notes, but maybe just a little bit more colorful. All right, so when we're breathing, the first thing that I want to know is that our goal when breathing is to take in oxygen, right? Oxygen comes in as our final electron acceptor in our process to get ATP in the Krebs cycle. So we're going to breathe in our oxygen, and our oxygen is going to enter into our lungs. Now, from there, that oxygen is going to go into our primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, into those alveolar ducts, and then finally our little alveolar sacs at the end. And from there, it's going to diffuse across the membrane and go into our bloodstream. Now, our blood is going to have this rich, fresh oxygen, which is going to be circulated down into the heart, and then the heart is going to take that fresh oxygenated blood and circulate it down to our tissue. Now, once it gets to our tissue, that oxygen is going to diffuse into our tissue and be used up in our Krebs cycle to produce energy and some other byproducts, but most importantly, it's going to produce our most kind of concerning byproduct, which is CO2, or the one of most importance, which is CO2. Now that CO2 is going to need to be gotten rid of, right? It's a waste product. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that CO2, it's going to diffuse across the membrane back into the blood, and then from there, it's going to circulate to our heart. Our heart is going to take that deoxygenated blood and circulate it back to our lungs. From there, it'll diffuse into our alveoli and then be able to be exhaled as CO2 through our mouth. So our main goal is to be taking in fresh oxygen, circulating it to the tissues that need it in our body, and then expelling CO2 as a waste product. But we need to know what the actual mechanisms of this oxygen being able to get in and our CO2 being able to get out. So what we're going to do is we're going to look closer. So what I've done is I've gone ahead and I've drawn some alveolar sacs right here, or some alveoli. So this is just basically looking at this magnified that way. So we've got our alveoli, and these are what's going to be taking in our fresh oxygen. Okay, so right away we have these alveoli that are full of oxygen. So I'm just going to go ahead and write O2 in all of these little guys because it's very rich. Now, if our alveoli are rich in oxygen, that means they're going to have a high partial pressure of oxygen, okay? So we have a high partial pressure of oxygen here. Now, in order to get it to that tissue, we need some sort of vesicle, okay? So we're going to use our bloodstream. So I'm just going to go ahead and draw a line from top to bottom, and this is going to represent that membrane between our sort of our alveoli and then our blood. All right, so this is our bloodstream right here. And I'll go ahead and write that at the top too so we can remember. This is blood stream. All right, and in our bloodstream, we have all sorts of stuff. We have plasma, which is just sort of the fluid, and then we've got these large, well, they're not large, but I'm going to draw it nice and large because I'm going to write in it. So this is going to be our red blood cell, okay? So I'm going to write RBC, okay? I'm actually going to draw another one up here. All right, so this is going to be another red blood cell. Okay, and there's a couple of different ways that oxygen is going to be able to get from the alveoli to the tissue. First and foremost, our partial pressure of oxygen is higher over here than it is over here. So I'm going to draw a down arrow here representing that our partial pressure of oxygen is going to be low on this side of our bloodstream. So because of that, oxygen is going to be able to diffuse directly across that membrane into our bloodstream. Now, once it's in our bloodstream, it has a couple of different ways of getting from this sort of point A to our point B, which is going to be our tissue. First and foremost, it can travel straight through our plasma and then go into our tissue. Because at this point, if we have all of this oxygen that's diffusing into our bloodstream, the partial pressure of oxygen on this side of our membrane is going to be higher than the partial pressure in our tissue, because our tissue is going to be using it up very quickly. So our first method right here is through our plasma. Now, it's important to note that this is a small amount of oxygen that's going straight through our plasma, and the majority of it is actually going to be traveling via our red blood cells. And what's going to happen is that oxygen is going to be binding to hemoglobin. Okay, so what we get is HbO2, and our hemoglobin is either going to drop a CO2 because hemoglobin will bind to CO2, or it's going to drop an H+. Okay, so we'll have these sort of free-floating H pluses in our red blood cells or in our bloodstream, all right? And then from there, once it's traveled down to our other tissues, it's able to diffuse out of that red blood cell and into our tissue. Now, our tissue is going to produce a couple of different byproducts from this, all right? So we're going to basically go into the Krebs cycle here, right? Because we're going to have aerobic respiration, and from that, we're going to get heat, or ATP. We're going to get water, and then we are going to get some CO2, all right? So out comes our CO2. All right. Now, CO2 has a couple of different ways that it can get from this tissue over back to our alveoli to be expired out of the body. Now, first and foremost, it's important to note that we have a higher partial pressure of CO2 on this side of our membrane because our tissue is producing a lot of it, whereas we have a lower partial pressure of it on this side. So CO2 is able to diffuse across this membrane pretty easily. Now, there's a couple of different ways once it gets into this sort of bloodstream area that it's able to travel to our alveoli. Just like oxygen, it's able to go through the plasma, okay? Now, a small portion of this is through the plasma. And again, our partial pressure of CO2 is going to be higher on this side of our membrane than it is on this, so it's able to diffuse and follow that concentration gradient. Now, the next way that it can go is through a process where it basically becomes an entirely different chemical. So what it's going to do is that CO2 is going to combine with water, okay? And it's going to yield a product, all right? And that product is going to be H2CO3. Now, H2CO3 is not entirely stable. And so what we get out of this is another product, which is going to be H plus HCO3 negative. Okay, and that HCO3 negative is how it's going to be traveling through our bloodstream. Now this H plus is going to be, remember how I said earlier up here, this hemoglobin dropped this H plus. So this H plus is what's going to be able to attach to hemoglobin. All right, so this is occurring out in our plasma, but this exact same process can occur inside of our red blood cells. So we're going to have CO2 that's going to bind with H2O, and from that we're going to get H2CO3. From that, we are going to get H plus and HCO3 negative. Now, HCO3 negative can't sit in a cell. It has to go out. So it is going to go outside of our cell. If we go outside of our cell, we're getting rid of a negative ion within our red blood cell. We need to put a negative ion back into our red blood cell so that things are even. So what happens is we have a chlorine shift. A chlorine shift, and that chlorine is going to come into our cell right here and take that place. So that's our chloride shift. All right, and then finally there is one more way that CO2 can travel in our red blood cells, and that is that it can attach to that hemoglobin after that hemoglobin drops that oxygen. All right, so hemoglobin and oxygen are CO2 and oxygen are both things that can attach to hemoglobin. And then from there, these things are sort of able to go backwards through the process and then go back to being CO2 and then exit through our alveoli. All right, so if I go ahead and I just write these steps out, okay, get a new screen here. Go ahead and make this white so it's easier to see. All right, so the first thing we want to know is how does oxygen leave the alveoli and travel to the bloodstream? All right, we're just going to write a couple of notes here. So if we're talking about oxygen, oops, that's not what I wanted. Okay, how does O2 get to tissue? All right, so there are two ways. It can go directly in the plasma, or it can attach to hemoglobin. All right, and both of these are able to occur because of a concentration gradient. What about CO2? How do we get CO2 out of the body? All right, CO2. Okay, the first is, again, directly in plasma. Now, in the fluid of our blood, so if I write fluid here, it can go through a process of steps. And that's going to be that CO2 is going to bind with H2O. From there, we're going to get H2CO3. And then from there, we're going to get H plus HCO3 negative. All right. The same process can occur in the blood. All right, so I'm just going to put a little exclamation point right there. That's the same process that's happening. However, that HCO3 negative is going to switch places with chlorine. All right, so that HCO3 negative is going to go into the blood, or the fluid of the blood, and that chlorine is going to enter that red blood cell. Okay, so I should make it, this is a blood cell right here. All right, and then once it gets back to that membrane, it's going to go through that process in reverse. All right, and then finally, number 4 is that CO2 can bind to hemoglobin. All right. Now, as far as quantities, which one is most important? This is going to be most important for oxygen, and these processes are going to be most important for CO2. Okay. So I hope that helped you understand it a little bit. I know that it was a little bit of a longer video, but I hope that that broke it down just a little bit more simple for you. So again, this is the process of taking oxygen in. We are going through the bloodstream to tissue. That oxygen is going to be broken into different components, and then we have that waste product of CO2, which needs to be transferred out of the body. All right. Well, I think you guys are going to do great, so good luck on your studying, and I hope things go well for you.